The art of self-reliance is forging your own path, but the path is difficult. Made easier by learning from those who have succeeded in directing their own lives on their own terms. With their help and inspiration, your path to self-reliance moves from dream to reality. And now, here's your host, Dr. Rodney King.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Art of Self-Reliance podcast. In this episode, I speak to neuroscientist and medical doctor, Dr. Russell Kennedy. Russell's work focuses on helping people recover from anxiety. He's the author of a fantastic book on this subject, Anxiety RX, which I highly recommend. In this episode, we discuss how to find the stress in your body, how to connect with your true self, and how to align your mind and body.
The art of self-reliance calls you to adventure, to develop your self-protection skills, to learn how to survive no matter where you find yourself, and to thrive amongst life's chaos.
Russell, here's my first question for you. When you hear the words self-reliance, what does that mean to you?
For me, self-reliance is building an inner strength that usually comes from childhood. Having a sense that you are whole and complete, your mind and your body are connected, and that you're operating as an agent for yourself, but you can also invite other people in to help you, because we need other people to engage our social engagement system. I'm a neuroscientist, so I study how people interact. So social engagement system is eye contact, facial expressions. I mean, the face is the only place in the human body where the muscles are attached directly to the skin, and that's because we can communicate with each other. Our faces say a lot. Tone of voice, prosody of voice, that kind of thing. There's a part of the brain called the superior temporal gyrus, the insula, which kind of connects mind and body together. So this starts when we're born. When we're first born, we interact with our mothers that way, with this social engagement system. And we mature this social engagement system because our relationship with our mothers and our relationships with the people that are close to us as we grow up mature that social engagement system. And as that social engagement system helps us deal with others and connect with others, we transpose it as we become older into a connection with ourselves. So if we don't have the connection with the other, it's very difficult to develop that connection with ourselves. So if you grow up with, a parent, my dad was schizophrenic, I understand your mom was alcoholic, it's one of these things where if you don't get that connection, that social engagement system doesn't mature. So it's very difficult to develop that relationship with yourself, because the relationship you have with other people can be no better than the relationship you have yourself. So when I hear self-reliance, I kind of think on one level, it's like, yes, it's being independent. It's being solid in your foot. It's your mind and your body are connected. You're operating as a whole being, but you need other people to actually operate as a whole being. So it's this dichotomy that I see, because there is this push in Western society to be, independent and self-reliant and that thing. And I think that comes from childhood. If you have a compromised childhood, that's difficult. But I think things like martial arts, anything that, works your mind and your body together allows you to connect. So I'm an anxiety expert. So my thing is that all anxiety is separation anxiety, and it's separation from yourself. So if you're not whole, this comes back to the whole self-reliance thing. If you're not whole and self-reliant, you're a sitting duck for anxiety, depression, OCD, all this kind of stuff. So when I hear self-reliance, I gotta get, part of me is like, yes, puff out my chest, be self-reliant. But the other really acknowledges the fact that we've needed people all along to build that neurological structure and a structure in our body that allows us to be that. Self-reliance is a luxury, that a lot of us don't get these days. There's a lot of stress in the world. So I see a lot of kids being raised without this real connected parent, and their self-reliance is going to struggle because they didn't develop the brain and body structure that allows that to develop in the first place. So that's a very long answer to your question. So self-reliance, yes, and the more you practice it, and this is what I love about martial arts, the more you practice that mind-body connection, the more self-reliance just becomes a natural byproduct of that connection of your mind and your body. Because once your mind and body are split, it's very, very difficult to develop self-reliance that isn't cognitive, that isn't like, okay, I'm going to go out there today, I'm going to do my best, rather than just coming from this inner knowing that you've practiced from being connected with your mind and your body. Once you have that inner knowing, you don't really need that bravado so much. So again, a long answer to your initial question.
No, that's a great answer. There's a lot there, so let's try to unpack some of that. First thought for me was, as you noted, we both came from difficult backgrounds and upbringing. That had a huge effect on my experience, and especially as an adult. If it wasn't for martial arts, I'm not sure where I would have ended up. So definitely that was my saving grace. The martial arts, as you noted, was a very pinnacle part of my experience and embodying myself and understanding myself, because I felt that I was completely separated. I understand completely what you're saying about being in this place of total anxiety, and really what that comes down to is that, like you noted, that separation from self. And for me, it was that when I was growing up, I felt like the odd one out. Like I didn't fit into the norm, into the standard kind of, the box that everybody was in. I was like the kid on the outside, which made things even worse, right? So you've got this dysfunctional household, and then you go into the outside world and you don't fit there too. And for the longest time, the way that I described it was, I don't know if you've ever had this experience or anybody else listening to this, but I would walk down the street, and one of the things I would find myself doing is I'd always put my hands in my pockets. And the reason I would do that is because I felt odd in my body, like I felt disassociated, like I was there, but I wasn't part of it, if that makes sense. And I think this speaks to what you're talking about, right? This idea of, anxiety as a separation from self.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem we're having with the kids, the teenagers and their screens, because we need a certain amount of social engagement, face-to-face social engagement, to mature this system. So if we're getting all our feedback from screens, which are two-dimensional and don't really relay, the energy behind it, we can see the face, but it's not really the same as being in front of someone. And that's the problem, again, with COVID these days, is we're not really right in front of each other anymore. A lot of our communications is through screens, which for an adult, as long as you had that when you were younger, is okay. But these kids aren't even getting that. So their social engagement system, Dr. Dan Siegel, who's a child psychologist, he also calls it the human resonance circuitry. So if this human resonance circuitry doesn't mature with face-to-face interaction, those kids have a hard time connecting to others, and as I was saying before, have a very difficult time connecting within themselves. So what they do is they get into anxiety, they get into depression, and then what do? They go back to their screens because they get the dopamine hit. They don't get the long-term oxytocin. Like when you get a hug from someone, 20 seconds or so, you get this oxytocin, which gives you this feeling of, I'm feeling pretty good. I'm connected. I'm part of the world. Whereas when you tap on Snapchat, you get a quick dopamine hit. So what we're doing in this society is we're exchanging dopamine short-term for oxytocin, which is kind of long-term, feeling content with your life kind of thing. So of course, when they get stressed, they're going to go right back to their phones and create more of the problem that created the problem in the first place.
So, building off that, I was just thinking as well, although I'm talking about this idea of self-reliance, I mean, the whole, the title of this podcast is The Art of Self-Reliance. But when I talk to people about it, and other guests that I've had, I make the point, and they've made the point too, is that when we say being self-reliant, we're not saying that in a kind of narcissistic kind of way. What we mean is, yes, you need to be in charge of your own experiences, but as you noted, you need to do it with other people. One of the consequences that I see as well, outside of obviously technology, and you noted the screens and that kind of disassociation that it creates, we're also, especially in the Western world, in a society where we continuously push towards individuality, and this kind of notion that you need to make it completely on your own, and it doesn't matter who you have to railroad in the process to get there. And so in a way, we're actually not really in community anymore either as well. So we've got that, and we've got, the technology, which is, separating us from each other.
Yeah, and dividing us all the time. Schwarzenegger talked about that when I heard him do an address saying, I was introduced as a self-made man. And I'm not a self-made man. Like I had my mother who, helped me with my homework. I had my dad who was around, supporting me. emotionally. I had all these other people. I slept on people's gym floors, like I had all these people supporting me. And sure enough, I mean, the guy learned a new language and became a governor of one of the states. But, he had other people helping him. But again, I think that comes down to when he was younger, he had that social engagement system. He had his mother. He had somebody, really making that ground nice and fertile so that he could keep growing on that. And as you point out, what we're doing in the society now is we're dividing each other. We're making every man for himself. And, the United States is probably the hallmark of that particular attitude. And look what's happening to them. I mean, they fight about everything. I mean, it's the only country that has, weapons of war in their national anthem. I don't know any other country that has bombs and rockets right in their national anthem. I mean, it's just part of, I'm a comedian, so I pick up stuff like this. Like I look at stuff and I go, that doesn't make sense. In your national anthem, it should be like, we're proud of ourselves, we've done well. We're not talking about blowing other people to bits.
So I think, where self-reliance became really important for me is going back to my childhood. I mean, my experience was that I couldn't be reliant on anybody. I mean, my mother was unreliable. I just didn't fit in. The school teachers were horrendous. It just wasn't a great experience for me. And so that I really took that on board, that in order for me to move forward in life, I'm going to have to be pretty much, I'm on my own, right? And I need to get through on my own. Where I think things changed for me was, as I noted, was martial arts. And in that sense, probably the best thing that I ever did was become an instructor, because that's where I started to develop that social bonds. That's where I started to realize how important it is to be in relationship with other people. And my way of creating that relationship was by teaching others and by helping others and by sharing, the struggles that I've gone through and the lessons that I've learned. And so that was a really good thing for me.
Yeah. And that's what comes. I mean, I have this sense that if you don't get it from, like when you're a child, your hands are kind of reaching up to get help, right? If you don't get that help, you don't learn how to be, I don't want to be insubordination, but submissive, right? So what we do a lot of times when we don't get our needs met when we're younger is we become the teacher. We go over the parent and we kind of start parenting the parent. I don't know if you did that with your mom. I certainly did it with my dad. So we become very familiar and confident in that role as teacher. But when it comes to being student again, it can take us back to that time that we weren't supported. So it's, you go for what you know. And clearly, I mean, you're a visionary. I mean, I can see that in you. I do have some sort of clairsentient energy reading ability, as much as saying that as a medical doctor makes me want to have a seizure. But the thing about us visionaries is we do often have tough childhoods. That's part, the people that don't have tough childhoods, the people that don't have addictions, don't change the world. Because things, if you grow up, your social engagement system's all locked in and nice and happy, there's no need for you to go outside that comfort zone. And it's those of us that have had trauma and have overcome the trauma and have lessons, but we realize, like, you look back and you go, your life could have been preordained. It could have been, look, your childhood's not going to be that good, Rod. It's just, they have a little chat with you before you're born and say, your childhood's not going to be that good. You're going to overcome it. You're going to teach, thousands of people, that kind of thing. But this is kind of how it's going to go. And I know I felt like a misfit as a child too. I mean, being a boy, being sensitive. I mean, I used to, I would cry when I was hurt until I was about 6. And of course, the other guys don't. They beat that out of you pretty fast. So when I look back at my childhood, I see exactly why it had to be the way it was, because it does teach you to look at the different part of the world. And I think that it's true with comedians too. Most of my friends who are comedians had childhood trauma because we had to look at the world in a very different way. And that different way, when you present that different way to someone else, it can be really funny. And I think that's a lot of comedy comes from pain, and a lot of comedy comes from childhood wounding.
Totally agree. So, just thinking about, somebody listening to this, let's get practical for a second. Regardless of how somebody got to the point where they are now, but let's say people, a person listening to this is completely stressed out. Let's talk about what's really driving that, right? In my experience, what I noticed is, and this is a culmination of stuff, but let me just use one example. For the longest time, I had this anxiety that was just running all the time in the background. And I wasn't really aware of it until I found myself in a place that didn't require me to be on alert. So for example, right now I'm on the Isle of Man, which is a beautiful island. It's a great place. There's beautiful spaces that you can go out into. It's not a place that I need to worry about somebody that wants to hijack me like I did when I came from Johannesburg, because that's where I lived all my life, right? And suddenly I'm aware that this anxiety is running hot. And so then I realized, how my sympathetic nervous system had become programmed to just run at a high level all the time. And so one of the things, and that's what I'm interested in and what I want to talk to you about, because you noted that one of the things we want to talk about is how do we find that stress in our body? I find that fascinating because I think that's a very different way of approaching it. Most people have this assumption that if they want to make any kind of change, they've got to change the way that they think. But I think that's only part of the story, right? It's like if you don't know what's happening in your inner state, the way that I describe it to people is your inner state dictates your fate.
And I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I don't even like the term anxiety. I don't think it has a lot of meaning. If I ask 10 people what is anxiety, 4 of them won't even know. 6 of them will probably give me some strange answer about sweaty palms or racing thoughts or whatever. So I use the term alarm. So with my patients, they say, oh, I'm feeling really anxious today. And I say, and they go, okay, I'm feeling really alarmed today. So, if you struggle with alarm or anxiety or whatever you want to call it at this point, and you're out with a friend and they say, how are you doing? And you say, I'm feeling really anxious today. They may not know what you're talking about. But if you say, look, I'm really feeling alarmed today. My body is really feeling alarmed today. And one of the things I do with my patients is I get them to find their alarm, because we worship the mind in this society. We live in a neck up society. So we assume that any angst must be coming from our head. And I put in my book is that if you were just a brain who was fed blood and cerebrospinal fluid, would you feel anything? Because I've been in on neurosurgeries. I've assisted on neurosurgeries where we cut right into the brain. The brain has no pain fibers itself. All we have to do is anesthetize the scalp and the skull. So there's no pain fibers in the brain. The pain comes from our body. So what I do is I get people to, bring up a trauma from their past in a way. And I can do it with you right now if you've got a second.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, think of a trauma that you had. Don't go for number one. No, don't go for a huge one, but think of a trauma that you've had. And just close your eyes for a sec, Rod, and just sort of think of that trauma and bring it to mind. And then focus on your body. Like, do you feel something in your body? Some people feel a pressure, pain, ache, hot, cold. Usually it's around the midline somewhere between your chin and your pubic bone, typically.
Yeah, that's exactly where it is. Yeah. I would say it's right here, just by my sternum. Yeah. Right? I can feel it, like slightly to my heart side, but it's there. I can feel it.
Yeah, and does it have sharp borders, or is it kind of ill-defined and diffuse, or?
Ill-defined.
Okay, and if it had a texture to it, would it be like coarse, or would it be smooth, or?
Coarse.
Okay, temperature, hot, cold?
Hot.
Okay, so hot, coarse, sort of ill-defined sensation around your heart, solar plexus area. So what I would say to you is that's your younger self. That's the part of you that was walking through Joburg with his hands in his pockets. And that's the part of you need to connect to. So when you feel alarm, anxiety, whatever you want to call it, put your hand over that spot, and really reassure yourself. It's like, I've got you. And again, as a medical doctor, this stuff, kind of freaks me out a little bit, but it's one of the things that sort of come through me over the last few years. And it's really paying attention to that connection, because that alarm could be your inner child or younger self or whatever you want to call it, kind of with his hands up, like reaching for you. And typically what we do is we go into our heads, we try and think it away. We'll distract, shopping, internet news, porn, alcohol, whatever. We'll get away from that. So if you had a child who came up to you with their hands up like that, like pick me up, hold me, and you pushed it away and went off to do, Facebook, what do you think that child's going to do? They're either going to shut down completely, or they're going to overreact. So the alarm is going to bubble up and get huge, and then it'll just shut down. So it's really, what I teach people is like, that's your anxiety. That alarm is your anxiety. So the more you can connect with that, the more you become whole. And the more you become whole, the less your sympathetic nervous system has to go into this fight or flight reflex, this hypervigilant, I can't let my guard down because I never know what's going to happen. And I see this a lot with people who have had parents who are alcoholics, parents who are sick, When they walked into the house, they never knew what they were going to get. This hypervigilance. So your sympathetic nervous system, it's almost like combat PTSD. Your mind knows that things are probably going to be okay, but your body doesn't. Your body keeps the score. Bessel van der Kolk talks about that, a psychiatrist from Boston. He wrote that book called The Body Keeps the Score. So my whole focus, I mean, not the whole focus, but most of my focus is in finding that alarm in your body and really focus on connecting to that, and not so much on a verbal level. I have this little mantra that I use called sensation without explanation. So I find that area and I just sit there with it and I watch my mind's compulsive need to try and make sense of it, because your mind is just a meaning-making, make sense machine. That's really all it is. So when it reads this uncomfortable feeling in your solar plexus, it's going to make a negative story out of it because it does feel negative. And then when you make a negative story or worry out of it, then the body reads that worry as if it's happening and creates more alarm, which creates more worry. So you get into what's called the alarm anxiety cycle. So what I do with people is I get them to focus specifically on their alarm and try and focus on as much sensation as they can without adding thoughts to it. Because as soon as you add thoughts to it, it becomes this runaway train. And the kicker on that is that your brain will try and convince you that you can think your way out of anxiety. You can think your way out of a feeling problem, and you can't. You have to feel your way out. And that's the problem I see with most therapies for anxiety, is that they talk about the issue. And it's, insight is the popcorn of psychotherapy. Knowing why, I know why I was anxious. I grew up with a schizophrenic father. You know why you had your stress. You grew up with an alcoholic mother. We know why. What we don't know is how to connect, how to repatch together that fundamental disconnect that happened when we were children.
So when you, doing this process that we just went through and you talked about it, which I think is very powerful, and I totally agree, just from my own work, this idea of getting into your feelings. You mentioned the sympathetic nervous system. Some people listening to this are not going to know what that is, so we can maybe unpack that. But do you find, and I mean, maybe you don't have necessarily the research for this, but just even if it's just your own experience, would you say that engages the other side of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, which brings you back to that homeostasis, that calming effect that you're looking for?
Yeah. Once that child in you feels connected, they can shut off the alarm. And that's what happens is and you have to practice it, because initially the child is very resistant. This is one of the things that I talk about, called defensive detachment, which is a term from Dr. Gordon Neufeld, who's a developmental psychologist, which is if you don't trust love when you're growing up, if your parent was inconsistent or abusive, when you get close to love again, you're afraid to have it because of what loving meant as a child. When I loved my dad, and he would come back from the mental hospital and he'd be okay for months at a time, and then he would start going crazy again. After he did that 3 or 4 times, I thought, it's not safe to love this guy. So I transposed that onto all my relationships. I've been married 3 times, so it's one of those things where when I got close to love, my alarm went up. So what I'm saying is it takes a while before you make that connection with that child, because that child is very resistant to connect with you. A, because you've probably not known they were there. You've probably been trying to treat it in your head for the whole time. And B, it's difficult to do because that child is kind of like, loving you isn't safe. So it's this slow kind of process. I talk about the stone cutter, the story of the stone cutter, where, there's this stone cutter in this ancient kind of time, and he's hammering away at this rock, but the chisel he has to use is huge because it's a huge rock, and the hammer he has to use, so he can only do 3 or 4 blows a day. And then he hits the thing about 99 times. And then someone walks by, and on the 100th time, he hits it, and the stone breaks in half. And the person watching goes, wow, you must be the best stone cutter in the world. You cut that up with 1 blow. So I'm saying, to connect with that alarm, to connect with that child, you need to be like the stone cutter. You need like 100 times. You've got to keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and showing that child in you that it can trust you, because it couldn't trust when you were younger. And once you get that, once you start developing that mind-body connection, that trust from you that you are now and the you that you were then, and once you join those two together, then you become self-reliant.
Yeah, it's true. And just so the audience knows, I mean, we mentioned your father a few times, and he suffered from schizophrenia and bipolar, correct?
Yeah. Yeah. So, he would be okay. Like I remember up until I was about 10, he was okay. And then we moved out to Victoria, British Columbia in Canada, just on the west coast of Canada. And he got admitted to hospital. And I was about 12, I guess. I talk about this in my book. When I was about 13, he tried to commit suicide. And I remember, I still remember looking out the window and watching the ambulance take him away after a suicide attempt and just feeling completely bereft. And that's when I said to myself, one day I'm going to make this mean something. And I think that's why I became a doctor and a neuroscientist and a yoga and meditation teacher and all that kind of thing. And I wrote this book because I really want to make a difference. I don't want, someone having to sit there and have to go through that again. And a lot of what think gets taught in classical therapy is not necessarily wrong, because we do need a coherent narrative of our lives. We do need a story in there. But I think they rely 90% on story, and maybe, if you're lucky, 10% on what's going on in the body. It's so rare to see a psychologist who really focuses on the body. My wife is a somatic trauma therapist, so she's finished her somatic experiencing training through Dr. Peter Levine's Institute. So she and I have lots of talks about how to connect with that inner child, how to make it feel safe, how to pendulate between. This is another thing that we didn't talk about when we did yours, but when you feel that pain in your body, try and find another place in your body that doesn't feel painful, because typically when that alarm comes up, it overtakes everything. If you have a wound, basically that's going to take a lot. Much of your consciousness is just focusing on that wound. But if you focus on another place, and I've had people focus on their elbow, some place that feels even neutral, and then just go back and forth between that feeling of being, alarmed, and a place in your body that doesn't feel alarmed. Your breath, sometimes they'll use that, and just go back and forth just to show your unconscious, when you get into this alarm state, it isn't all there is. There are other places in your body where it is safe. Because I think as a child, because we do regress when we go back into those things, when we have big fights with our partners, we regress back to the time where we felt helpless. And we are now, 8, 9, 10 years old, waiting for our dad to come back or whatever. And we're not us. We don't have that wherewithal that we do now. So what I'm saying is, find that child. When you get alarmed, put your hand over it, breathe into it, like really, and try not to think too much about it. It's an unconscious. Things have to be healed at the unconscious level. So the more talking, in a way, the harder it makes it to really connect. And it's just this calm, quiet, you can say, I've got you, or, you're here with me, I'm going to look after you. But even then, it's kind of like just making this unconscious intention, in a way, if there is such a thing. I don't even know if there is such a thing, to connect with that part of you that's hurt, and really, and just sit with it without trying to go, okay, well, I was bullied, so that's the reason, or really without looking for a reason why he's hurt or she's hurt. Just feeling it, just being there with her, and just really having that, almost that unconscious thing where no words are said. It's just that, I'm here, I'm with you. I know that's words, but it's just sensation without explanation is basically kind of what I get into.
Yeah, I think that's very powerful. I was just thinking as you were talking. So one of the things that I did was, coming from the experience that I did and just suffering from that alarm that was on all the time, 24/7, and being in an environment where I was surrounded by bullies and getting picked on all the time was one of the reasons I went into martial arts. And for a very long time, which is kind of interesting, is that although I was using my body and I should have known better how to use my body effectively, I was using it in all the wrong way. So rather than doing the work that you're suggesting now, I was using my body as a way to express more violence. And that was my coping mechanism to try to overcome that anxiety, so to speak, that I suffered as a child, only to realize much later on, and literally like in the last 7 years, that I was going down the wrong path, and I had to make a complete turnaround. And it's so interesting is that now, just even though I still practice and I'm still a martial artist, the thought of actually engaging with people in that space where it's that physical dominance no longer holds an appeal for me. It's just something that I find, I just can't do it anymore. And it's kind of an interesting turnaround for me. And part of that was going back to school, educating myself, doing my doctorate, in essence, in mindfulness. And a lot of what you're talking about of just sitting with what is happening without having to explain it is this idea of being mindful with what is arising.
Absolutely. And I think, in a lot of my teachings, I think mindfulness kind of, it gets you right to the edge, and then it just sort of, it falls short in that you have this mindful setup where you calmed your mind, you're in the center of the body. That is the time that you are compassionate, loving, connected to yourself. So it's not just about being mindful. It's not just about, watching the different colors in the room and feeling your butt on the chair, or, the sensation or the smells. That's part of it. But I feel like that stops short. I think that when you're in that state, that's the time where you say, okay, now how can I connect with all of me? How can I connect with that part of me that was singing in the school play and got embarrassed because they forgot their lines? How can I, make peace with that kid who got slapped in the back of the head by his dad in the grocery store and was totally embarrassed? How can I, that's the time to use it. So that's why I feel about one of the things I have about mindfulness. I think it's wonderful. I just think that you're in this perfect position at that point to really start connecting with yourself rather than just staying in that moment. It's like, yes, absolutely stay in that moment. But then at that point, take it one step further and go, okay, I'm in this mindful place. How can I really connect with that younger part of me that may still be hurting inside, may still be alarmed?
So yeah, that's very interesting that you say that. So one of the things that I did in my research was that the way that I described it was mindfulness in action. And I took an embodied perspective. So rather than just purely looking at it from a cognitive standpoint, what I wanted and what I did with the people that I worked with, and I worked specifically with leaders, but what I did with them was to get them into that mindful space as you described, but then to do something. And what I asked them to do were embodied actions. Now that could be just breath work as an example. So that's one of the things that we shifted into. So we went from being in a state that you weren't really happy with. You then put yourself into more of a mindful presence, which gives you the distance and the space that you need to then choose a different behavior. And the behavior that I asked them to choose was breath work, as an example. There were other things that we did. And so just by learning to do that, they started to realize, and coming back to what I said early on, right? My tagline often is your inner state dictates your fate. And so if you can learn to manage your inner state more effectively, and one way is through this idea of mindfulness with some action, as you noted,
right?
Then you can completely change the outcome of your experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And getting back to what you said earlier, it seemed like you were kind of, in a way, kind of judging yourself for getting into, martial arts where it was kind of aggressive and kind of violent and that kind of thing. That was exactly what I meant about early on. Like, we can't go from a flat-footed position to loving ourselves or anyone else unconditionally, right? We have to go through the body, and we have to do it gradually, like the stonecutter. So I think the read I get from you is that was your way of engaging with your body first, because, maybe engaging with your body in a very loving, kind of connected way wasn't available to you initially, right? So that was your path to kind of come around the backside and then integrate that into a place where now you are, and the fact that you're not interested so much in the violence thing means that you've integrated a lot of that trauma, because if it's not a trigger for you anymore, or if it's not a desire to fulfill anymore, it means you've integrated it. And that's, when we can start integrating our old traumas, like I still feel responsible for my mother. She's 87, and I'm a doctor. So anytime she feels ill of any kind, she'll call me, right? So she'll usually go, hi, Mom. It's like, I'm just not feeling well today, and I've got nausea. And it's like, in my mind, I'm like, this is annoying. But then I have to kind of see her for the child that she is, and just sort of sit there and listen to her. And often it's not so much that I have to fix her. It's just that she needs to be heard, and I think that's so true with our inner child too. It just really needs to be heard. We've been stuffing it down, especially men. We've been stuffing it down for so long that, it doesn't doesn't feel hurt, and we don't make an active process to look for it, to find it, and to sort of connect with that part of ourselves. And as long as we don't do that, it will stay in this immature form, which will cause us a lot of alarm and a lot of grief. And that's my whole thing about treating people with anxiety, because I suffered with it for many years myself, is just it comes from that younger part of you. It doesn't come from the part of you that's an accomplished, martial artist, speaker, all that's the part of you that you've learned the lesson and you've grown from. But that part of you that, is walking down the street with his hands in his pockets, is still in you.
Yeah, and I think your analysis is 100% correct. And again, it took me 20 years, 2 decades to get to this point, to have this realization. It's the stonecutter, right? I mean, it doesn't just happen overnight. I think you're absolutely right. There is no way that I could have gone into a space of loving and compassion coming out from what I came from. Really, that going into the martial arts and focusing purely on the fight, so to speak, was the one way for me to kind of try to come to grips with what was happening. And it's taken me 2 decades to figure out that actually, what I was looking for. So
yeah.
There's no quick fixes, right? And that's what people need to understand.
It took me 4 decades, so you're 20 years ahead of me. I did my first, I found a lot of this on when I took LSD. I've taken a few of the psychedelics, not a lot. I haven't done many experiences on it, but when I took LSD, that's when I started finding this alarm in my body, because I was really focused on, treating my mind. How is my mind overreacting, and trying to suppress the thoughts, or trying to, redirect the thoughts into something positive, which was, as you say, your body is going to determine what you think. So if my body's in constant alarm and hypervigilance, trying to think in opposition to that is like Sisyphus pushing up the rock. Like you're never going to reach the end of that. It's just a complete war. So it was just kind of just retreating, relaxing, just knowing that things are going to be okay if I just connect with myself. And it took a while. Like it really took a while to get into that self-connection place. And I still practice it every day. And, I'll say that to your listeners, when you're feeling anxious, alarmed, find it in your body. Like, put your hand over that, breathe into it, like really connect to that. I mean, out of all of the things that I tell people, the other thing that I say is if you're going to think a thought, I'm not that crazy about people thinking thoughts. I'd rather them just go into the sensation of their body. But if you're going to think a thought, think, am I safe in this moment? Works in the middle of the day, the middle of the night. Anxiety is always about the future. It's always about something that may or may not happen, some sort of prognostication of evil that's going to happen in the future. So if you bring yourself precisely into the moment, put your hand on that area of alarm, bring yourself into the core sensation, then and you'll realize that you are actually safe in that moment. And then for some people, it's the first time they've actually allowed themselves to feel safe, because they've felt like they've had to keep this vigilance up, because of, it's almost like combat PTSD. There's always this sense that you could be killed at any moment. So your body keeps reacting like, you could be killed at any moment, but your mind knows it's not. So it's a matter of just, even if you just say for a few seconds, am I safe for the next 5 seconds? Yeah. Am I safe in this moment? Well, this moment's all you have. So if you're ever really, really stressed about something, just ask yourself, I know you're really stressed right now, but are you safe? Like in this moment, are you safe? Like in the moment? I know, in 2 weeks you've got to speak in front of a crowd, and then you've got this huge exam coming up in 2 days. But right now, right in this moment, are you safe? And then when you acknowledge to yourself that you actually are safe, that sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight nervous system, can stand down. And then the alarm drops in your body. And when your alarm drops in your body and you get more relaxed, your thoughts don't look nearly as ominous as they do when your body is in alarm. So your body will dictate. You could have the same exact thought, and if your body's relaxed, thought won't bother you. If your body's, hyperreactive and sympathetic fight or flight, that thought will seem way, way, way worse than what it really is.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. So how do we then connect with our true self? I mean, what do you mean by the true self? I think that can kind of be slippery for some people.
Well, now we're going to go into the philosophical part. I mean, we're all born innocent, right? I mean, even Trump was born innocent. So what happens is, if we don't get our needs met, as children. If we don't get our attachment needs met as children, we develop these coping strategies. Narcissism is a coping strategy. Anxiety is a coping strategy. So we develop these kind of offshoots to kind of get our needs met in a backhanded way because we can't get them met naturally. And those become personality traits, and they get ingrained in us over the course of time because they do work. Worry for a child does work. It does give you this illusion because kids worry, okay, I wonder if my mom's going to be drunk, and I get home and she's not. It's like, oh. So what was happening immediately before you opened that door was you were all hyped up and worried, and then when you found out that everything was okay, you get this hit, this rush of, oh, everything's okay. And what were you doing just before that? You were worrying. So you're operantly conditioning yourself to worry. So, when you worry and it doesn't come true when you're younger, worry starts becoming this kind of go-to. Now, consciously, worry doesn't do much, especially as an adult. But as a child, and you worry about something and that worry doesn't happen, A, you get a dopamine hit when it doesn't happen. And B, you get this sense of like, okay, I guess the worry did something. So unconsciously, you keep repeating it. So we're all born innocent, getting back to the original thing. And it's just really seeing your innocence. There's nothing you said, thought, did to anyone that hasn't been said, thought, or done to anyone in millions and millions of times. You're not special. Your shame is not special. But we think it is. We think that what we've done is the worst thing in the world. And like I said, whatever you thought, said, or did has been done millions of times before you and will be done millions of times after you. So it's realizing that at your core, you're an innocent soul, and any faults, or personality traits that you don't like were adaptive. You needed to develop those personality traits to get your needs met. And then we judge ourselves for it negatively. And then that just starts this whole cycle of self-separation. It's like, okay, well, I had to become a worrier as I grew up. So now, and then I judge myself, well, you're so weak for having to worry about everything. Man, you're weak. And that just, the cycle just continues. So whatever your negative personality traits or what you perceive as negative about yourself, just realize that you probably had to adopt that trait or behavior to survive, to get your needs met in kind of, like I said, a backhanded way because you weren't getting them met naturally. So it really becomes this philosophical question of seeing yourself as an innocent soul and not judging, abandoning, blaming, or shaming yourself, what I call jabs: judgment, abandonment, blame, and shame. Because those things will keep you locked in that behavior. So when you start connecting with yourself, you don't need to judge yourself anymore. You don't need to abandon yourself anymore. You don't need to blame or shame yourself anymore because you realize you're just a human being. The things that you've done that are bad, you did because you had to try and get your needs met somehow. And that's where I see about the connecting with yourself is just realizing that your negative traits are there, one, to teach you something and to point you in the direction of where your pain is. And two, it's a way of connecting with yourself. You can actually, when you do talk to your inner self, say, I know you had to develop a little bit of narcissism because, your parents didn't pay attention to you. You needed the attention. So, that's okay. And that's okay. We just realize that that's part of us and we embrace it because, as Brene Brown says, you can't change anything that you don't embrace. So the negative, I'll say one more thing, the negative parts of you, if you judge them, you're locked in them. But if you accept them and even embrace them, and Kyle Cease, the comedian kind of transformational speaker, he says stuff like that. Like he'll say, I don't know if he uses this term, like I'm a narcissist. And I love that about myself. He'll say, I'm this, like what we consider negative. And then at the end of it, he goes, and I love that, about myself or whatever. So it really, turns it around 180 degrees as to how you look at yourself. Because if you can accept that part of you that you've been shaming and blaming and abandoning yourself for, then you can start really connecting. And when you really connect with yourself, that's true self-reliance.
So when I think back to my childhood and we're talking about true self, there was a time there before I became aware of all the problems, before I became aware of my mom's problems and the neighborhood and the kids and everything else. It's probably just before 6. And I can actually remember what the feeling used to feel like to be me. And it was a moment, it was a time of awe, I just felt in tune with the world. I was excited when I, learned or discovered new things. And if there was, especially if it was holiday and I knew I was going to be able to do whatever I wanted to do the next day and climb trees, whatever that may be, I can remember those feelings. And so what I've been really working on over the last several months, and it's very difficult, I'm not going to lie, is trying to recapture that, trying to go back. So when I'm now, out on a walk and I happen to be in this beautiful place, I try to remember, if I was my 6-year-old self, how would I feel about that? How would I engage with that experience? And trying to just remind myself to try to go back to that. And that's really helped. I mean, it's slow progress, but it's helping.
Yeah, and I think, and that is a cognitive way of doing it too. So what I would suggest to at that point, Rod, is to go into that feeling like in a quiet time or whatever on your bed or whatever, and see where you feel that feeling of contentment in your body. Like, usually, again, it's usually in the midline, somewhere between your chin and your pubic bone, and see if you can really, go through that thing. Like, is it bounded? Is there a texture to it? There's no hardcore science to it. It's basically just trying to get a real feel for what that sense of contentment really felt like in your body. And then when you feel that, if you can sort of classify it and sort of hold it, then when you feel the alarm, see if you can pendulate or oscillate between that alarm feeling you have in your solar plexus and then this feeling of contentment that you have in your body. If you can go back and forth between those, it teaches your unconscious mind that you're not all encompassed by this alarm. There is actually a place in you that's calm, that's peaceful, that's quiet. And then you teach your unconscious, which is where all these programs are. You teach your unconscious at the level that was encoded of peace and calm. And it may not help right away, but it usually does. But it may not. But over the course of time, that it's like pouring a little bit of cold water in tea that's boiling hot so that you can drink it, right? So it's modifying that alarm sense with the feeling before. Because one of the things about psychedelics is they sometimes they will take people back to that exact place that you were describing before all this crap started developing. There's one called Ibogaine, which they use for heroin withdrawal. And people describe going back to this place of, this is before all the crap went down. This is before everything. It's almost like there's a reset going on to take you back to that place. And then you operate from that place as if, the trauma had never happened. So there's really interesting research going on now in psychedelics as far as this kind of stuff goes. And I think that's going to be the future. I think somatic therapy, like interactive psychotherapy, and psychedelics are going to be the two biggest things in psychotherapy in the next 5 or 10 years for sure.
So this process that you're describing, Russell, that you just described now, is that what you mean by aligning your mind and your body? Because I'm assuming that's what you...
It's one of them. Yeah, it's one of them. There's other ones that you can, there's other ones that are more cognitive, like you can sort of sit in that quiet time, find that alarm spot and go, I have a patient that I work with, and he said everything was fine until he came around the corner and saw the for sale sign on his parents' lawn, and then realized that they were actually getting a divorce. The divorce was real. So I get him to go back to that particular place, find that sensation in his body, and we work through that, because we hold these traumas in our body. We worship the mind, and I know this is weird coming from a neuroscientist, but we hold these traumas in our body, and our mind only has a certain depth into that. I said you can't heal a feeling problem with a thinking solution, and you've got to get in the same room with that old program. So we sort of got him into semi-hypnotic state where he felt that, and he could see the colors. It was a Reliance sign, which is a real estate company here in Canada, and the colors, the red and the white and the blue, and the even remember the realtor's name. Like, this stuff gets seared in his memory. So we just slowly went through that and then showed him how safe he actually was, because that was the point where he split. So, and then we worked on that for quite a while, and then it was just like, then he could see that sign, and he said to this day, every time I see a Reliance sign, it triggers me. And like you said earlier on, where you don't need the need for the violence so much anymore. He sees a sign now, and he said it's not pleasant. He says, but it triggers me that I need to look after myself. Like, now I look at that sign, and rather than being all upset about it, I look at it and go, oh, okay, how can I connect with myself here? Which is basically, true self-connection and true self-reliance. Like, he doesn't need me anymore. The sign doesn't trigger him anymore.
Mm. So as we come to the end, what words of wisdom would you want to leave us with?
Anxiety is not anxiety. Anxiety is actually a state of alarm that you hold in your body. And as you say, the way your body feels is the way you're going to see the world. And it's really focusing on that alarm and connecting with that alarm, because that alarm is your younger self. It is the part of you that probably went through some significant trauma that isn't integrated or healed yet or metabolized. And the best way of metabolizing that is with feeling, connecting to that feeling, and also having some therapy to sort of understand the story behind it. I'm not against psychotherapy at all. What I am against is just only doing talk therapy, only doing psychotherapy. So I'm saying just really connect in your body and really start, like the stonecutter, connecting with that younger self and realizing that kid has probably been pushed aside for years, maybe decades. So they're not going to trust you right away. It's going to take them a while before you trust them. So you can say, it must have been really hard for you when you came around that corner and saw that sign on your parents' lawn. And I feel you. I'm with you. Like I have you now. And we all have traumas from our childhood, and we can talk to ourselves like that in quiet moments. Calm yourself down, and then just go through some of the traumas. On one level, that's a thinking solution again. So on one hand, I want you just to feel it and just stay with it and just stay with the feeling and avoid thinking about it. But then after you do that for a while, then you can go into that. It must have been really, really hard for you as a 12-year-old boy coming around the corner on your bike and seeing that sign, and then seeing what they say back to you. They may not say anything for a while, but just stay in quiet. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is just wait. There's no rush. When you're connecting with your inner self, there's no rush. And in fact, sometimes that child is waiting and waiting and waiting to make sure that it's safe. So you have to outwait them because if you try and force it, it just doesn't come. They have to really trust you at an unconscious level. And that comes from connecting through your body.
To learn more about the art of self-reliance, our virtual coaching service, online courses, and our retreats in Thailand, head over to Primal Skills. That's with a Z.com.